There is a strange quiet that comes when one truly begins to listen, not to the voices around us, nor even to the voice within us, but to something higher, something other. The world clamors for our attention, endlessly calling out through distractions, demands, and desires. Yet the soul, if it is to be nourished, must first withdraw. It must learn to look up instead of outward, inward only in as much as it is seeking the one who formed it. And that, my friends, requires focus. Not the kind of focus that tightens the jaw or narrows the eyes, but the kind that opens the heart and bends the will. To focus on God is to turn deliberately away from everything that clamors for importance, and to lift the eyes beyond the fog of the temporary. It is to acknowledge that the center of the universe is not the self, nor the stage of this world, but the quiet majesty of the Creator. We do not find him by shouting louder or thinking harder, but by stillness and surrender. The mind that is truly set on God ceases to be preoccupied with proving itself or being heard. It begins instead to marvel, marvel at grace, marvel at mercy, marvel that the one who made stars stoops low enough to care for hearts like ours. Humility, then, is not some mere virtue among others. It is the gateway, for pride is not simply a sin. It is the mother of all sin. It places the self upon a throne that belongs to another. It is pride that tells us we deserve answers, that we must speak first, that our view is the right one. But humility sees with clearer eyes. It does not think less of itself, but thinks of itself less. It recognizes its own smallness, not with despair, but with reverence, for to be small before God is to be seen by him, and to be seen by him is to be loved. Not because we are worthy, but because he is love. Silence is the final step, not the silence of fear, nor the silence of indifference, but the silence of awe. There are truths too deep for speech, joys too sacred for noise. When we stand before God, truly stand, not in imagination but in spirit, we will not rush to speak. We will not try to impress. We will simply be still. The soul that has seen even a glimpse of God's glory has nothing to prove and everything to receive. And sometimes the most faithful prayer is the one that says nothing at all. This kind of silence is an act of trust. It is saying, I do not need to control this moment. I do not need to defend myself. I do not need to be noticed. I only need to abide. We are so quick to fill the air with our anxieties, our ambitions, our explanations. But heaven speaks most clearly into quiet hearts. If we could but quiet our minds long enough, we might hear not the thunder but the whisper that tells us who we truly are, not what the world calls us, but what the Maker declares. So focus. Focus not on your failures or your fears, but on the face of God. Humble yourself, not because you are worthless, but because he is worthy, and stay silent, not forever, but long enough to remember that your voice was never meant to replace his. Let the silence speak. Let it become the place where faith grows, where love roots deeply, and where the soul finds its true home, not in noise, not in pride, but in the stillness where God is. True focus on God requires detachment from the noise and demands of the world. To focus on God in a world that is constantly pulling at our attention is no small feat. The heart is easily distracted, the mind quickly overwhelmed, and the soul often burdened by the ceaseless demands of modern life. Distraction is not merely a nuisance, it is a danger. It pulls our gaze downward, shifts our priorities, and subtly alters our affections. One need not be deliberately rebellious to drift away from the divine. A simple preoccupation with the trivial, the urgent, or even the seemingly important can cause us to lose sight of what is eternal. It begins slowly, imperceptibly, a missed prayer here, a rushed morning there, a failure to ponder or give thanks, and before long we find ourselves spiritually famished, not because God has left, but because our eyes have wandered. True focus on God requires a deliberate turning of the soul. It is not passive, it is intentional. The one who truly seeks to set their mind on things above must first recognize that this world, for all its noise and glitter, is not home. The sights and sounds around us are fleeting, constantly shifting, rarely satisfying. They demand our time, energy, and devotion, but offer little in return. In contrast, God calls us into stillness, not to withdraw in fear, but to reorient in truth. It is in the quiet spaces that we begin to hear what matters most. Silence becomes a sanctuary, not of emptiness, but of clarity. It is where the clutter of the world begins to fall away, and the presence of God begins to take center stage. Focusing on God is also a matter of the will. The emotions fluctuate, the intellect wrestles, but the will must be trained to return again and again to the source. This training does not happen in a moment. It is the result of repeated acts of surrender. Just as an athlete disciplines the body, the faithful disciple disciplines the soul. They remove what distracts, even if it is not inherently evil, and replace it with that which nourishes. Scripture becomes not just a text, but a lens through which to see the world. Prayer ceases to be a duty and becomes breath. Worship is no longer an activity, but a posture of the heart. These are the tools through which focus is sharpened, and the divine presence is felt. The challenge, of course, is that we are surrounded by a culture that prizes distraction. To be constantly stimulated, constantly entertained, and constantly busy has become the new measure of success. To say no to the noise feels countercultural, even radical, but it is in this refusal that the soul begins to live. The more we practice turning our eyes toward God, the more we recognize how little the world can truly offer. The glitter begins to fade, the pressure to perform begins to ease, the desire to be seen by others is replaced by the joy of being seen by Him. And in that gaze, the soul is changed. It becomes quiet, content, and courageous, not because of its own strength, but because it is anchored in something that cannot be shaken. To focus on God is not to ignore reality, it is to see it rightly. It is to recognize that behind every good gift is the giver, and that every trial is an invitation to draw near rather than to despair. It is to understand that our days are numbered, not in a morbid sense, but in a way that grants urgency to what truly matters. When the soul is fixed on the eternal, the temporary begins to fall into place. Decisions are made not based on comfort, but on calling. Relationships are approached not with selfishness, but with reverence. Time is no longer wasted because it is seen as holy. This kind of focus brings freedom, freedom from comparison, from anxiety, from the gnawing need to prove or possess. It does not come quickly, and it must be renewed daily, sometimes moment by moment, as the soul fights to keep its gaze on what is unseen, but more real than anything visible. Humility is the posture that opens the soul to divine presence and grace. Humility is not thinking less of oneself, but recognizing the truth of one's position before the eternal. It is the sober acknowledgement that we are creatures and not the Creator, that we are finite and not infinite, that we are sustained moment by a grace we neither earn nor control. Humility removes the illusion that we are the center of all things. It dismantles the facade of self-sufficiency and exposes the deeper reality, that all good things come from above, and that without the sustaining hand of the divine, even our breath is borrowed. The proud heart sees no need for God. The humble heart cannot imagine a moment without Him. To humble oneself is not to deny one's worth, but to understand that that worth is derived, not created within. It is gifted, not achieved in the world's eyes. Humility often appears as weakness. The culture celebrates pride, self-promotion, and independence. The louder the voice, the stronger the persona, the more attention it receives. Yet in the divine economy, The last are first, the meek inherit the earth, and the one who kneels is the one who is lifted. The paradox of humility is that by lowering oneself, one is elevated in the eyes of God. But that elevation is not the aim. The aim is surrender. It is the relinquishing of one's claim to the throne of their own life. It is the quiet confession that we are not wise enough to guide ourselves, not strong enough to carry our burdens alone, and not righteous enough to stand unassisted. True humility is not self-hatred, nor is it the mask of false modesty. It does not draw attention to itself with quiet boasts or pious pretenses. Rather, it is marked by simplicity, gratitude, and an open heart. The humble do not compare themselves to others, for they are too aware of their own dependence on grace. They do not speak much of themselves because they are preoccupied with something greater. They are not easily offended because their ego is not their God. They are quick to forgive because they know how much they have been forgiven. And they are slow to judge because they understand the weight of their own imperfections. Humility is not something that comes naturally to the human heart. It must be cultivated, often through suffering, often through the stripping away of illusions. Trials become the schoolhouse for the soul, where pride is broken and self-reliance is shattered. When life does not go according to plan, when strength fails, when wisdom proves inadequate, the door to humility begins to open. It is in these moments, when the hands are empty and the heart is aching, that one can begin to see rightly, not through the lens of self, but through the lens of dependence. Not through achievement, but through surrender. The humble soul learns to rest in the knowledge that it is not the master of its own fate. It embraces the limitations of humanity and finds peace in knowing that there is one who is limitless. It finds joy not in applause, but in obedience. It values truth over image, substance over appearance, and in doing so, it becomes more free, not less. Free from the exhausting burden of trying to be enough. Free from the need to control how one is perceived. Free from the tyranny of ego that demands constant affirmation and recognition. Humility opens the door to wisdom, for only the humble can be taught. It opens the door to love, for only the humble can see others as more than means to an end. And it opens the door to communion with God, for only the humble are small enough to enter the narrow way. Sacred silence allows the heart to hear what pride and noise drown out. Silence is not merely the absence of sound, it is the presence of depth. In the sacred stillness, where the noise of the world recedes, the soul begins to awaken to truths too profound to be spoken aloud. In a culture where every opinion must be voiced, every thought shared, and every moment filled with stimulation, silence becomes a radical act of trust. To remain silent before God is not to retreat in fear, but to posture the heart in reverence. It is to acknowledge that not all things need immediate answers, not every emotion needs to be aired, and not every situation calls for human commentary. Silence is the language of surrender, a wordless confession that God is wiser than our reasoning and closer than our speaking. To stay silent is not to be passive, but to become deeply engaged with something higher than human reaction. It is a way of stepping back from the frantic rhythm of performance and stepping into the unshakable presence of the eternal. When the lips are closed, the heart can finally begin to listen. There are truths that cannot be shouted, only received. There are comforts that cannot be delivered through noise, only discovered in quiet. Silence allows the clutter of thoughts and feelings to settle so that clarity may rise. It invites the soul to sit with discomfort, to resist the urge to escape with words, and to instead lean into the refining fire of stillness. Silence is also an act of humility. It refuses to insist on its own importance. It does not rush to justify, to explain, to defend, or to impress. It waits, it listens, it yields. This is not the silence of defeat, but the silence of confidence, a deep, unshakable assurance that the one who sees in secret also speaks in secret. There is no need to fill the air with petitions when the heart is already known. There is no need to strive for eloquence when the Spirit intercedes beyond words. In the holy hush, we remember that we are not heard for our many words, but for our sincere hearts. And in that memory, we rest in the Scriptures. Some of the most profound encounters with God took place in silence. The still, small voice did not come in the wind or the earthquake or the fire, but in a gentle whisper. Job, after all his questions and complaints, covered his mouth when God finally spoke. Christ himself, when accused, chose silence over defense. There is a time to speak, but there is also a time to be still. In the stillness, we make space for awe. We make room for wonder. We give permission for mystery to remain mystery. To stay silent also guards the soul against many dangers. Words spoken in haste can wound. Arguments entered in pride can destroy peace. Responses made from fear can mislead. But silence creates a pause, and in that pause, wisdom can enter. The one who learns to be silent becomes slow to anger, slow to judge, and slow to despair. Silence is not a void but a vessel, holding within it the possibility of divine encounter. It is the soil where trust grows, where hope deepens, where love finds its truest form. Those who live in silence learn to speak with weight. Their words are fewer, but they are full. Their presence is quieter, but it carries peace. Their counsel is slower, but it reflects heaven. Silence does not diminish a person. It refines them. It allows space for God to act, to reveal, to transform. It teaches patience in an impatient world, reverence in a flippant age, and depth in a shallow culture. And through it, the soul learns that God is not merely heard in thunder, but in the gentle quiet where no words are needed.